My son had been dead for exactly 43 days when I found the platinum wedding band taped behind the fuse box panel of his shattered sports car. Julian had never been married. To the rest of the world, he was a brilliant, single, 32-year-old executive vice president of Sterling Global Dynamics, a man dedicated entirely to the logistics empire my father had built and I had expanded. But the moment my daughter Victoria saw the small velvet-lined box in my hand, her face drained of all color. She snatched it from my grip, her manicured nails digging into my skin, and spat that it was just a piece of junk. A meaningless trinket Julian must have picked up at a flea market a few minutes later. Thinking I had gone back inside the main estate, she dragged her husband, Charles, into the shadow of the garage. I stood behind the heavy, rusted iron door, my breath catching in my throat as my own daughter whispered, "Charles, Dad cannot find out about Clara. If she brings that little girl here, we lose Julian's 35% of the company." I stood there, absolutely frozen, the autumn wind howling through the Georgia pines as the words "that little girl" echoed in the chambers of my mind. Welcome back to Arthur's real-life justice. My name is Arthur Sterling. My child had every opportunity to do the right thing, to choose family over greed, but she chose the dark path of betrayal. If you believe that a father's love can pierce through any web of lies, make sure to leave a comment with your thoughts as we begin this journey. 6 weeks ago, under a bleak, rain-heavy sky, I buried my only son. The local sheriff's report was cold, clinical, and devastating. Julian's classic 1969 Mustang had spun out on a treacherous, fog-shrouded curve along Route 9. There were no traces of alcohol, no illicit substances, no signs of a second vehicle. Just a sudden, blinding sheet of mountain fog, a slick asphalt patch, a broken steel guardrail, and a phone call at 9:17 in the evening that shattered my life into 1,000 jagged pieces. For 43 days, I believed that the cruelest agony a father could ever endure was watching his only son's mahogany casket lower slowly into the damp earth, hearing the hollow thud of soil striking the wood. I was wrong. The cruelest thing was discovering 6 weeks later that the very people who had held my trembling shoulders at the cemetery, the ones who had wept loudest in the front pew, had used Julian's sudden death as a shield to rob the woman he adored, to erase the grandchild I never knew existed, and to plunder everything my son had spent his entire life building. It was a crisp, dry Tuesday afternoon when I decided to personally clean out Julian's wrecked car before releasing it to the salvage yard. The insurance adjusters had finished their work, leaving the mangled metal skeleton of the Mustang sitting in the lower equipment shed of my estate. The faint metallic tang of scorched steel, mixed with the damp scent of dried pine needles and old leather, still clung heavily to the interior. I knelt on the cold concrete floor, my knees aching, systematically removing the singed floor mats and searching for Julian's vintage silver pocket watch, a family heirloom I had given him on his graduation from Yale. My fingers traced the bent metal of the passenger footwell, reaching deep behind the loose plastic panel of the passenger side fuse box. My fingertips brushed against something unnatural. A hard, smooth, rectangular surface with a firm pull. I dislodged a palm-sized black magnetic lockbox. It had been secured tightly to the interior chassis with layers of thick silver industrial tape. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I peeled back the stubborn adhesive, my hands trembling, and flipped open the magnetic lid. Inside lay 3 objects. First, a heavy, polished platinum men's wedding band, pristine and gleaming against the black foam lining. Second, a folded yellow receipt from a high-end jewelry boutique in Savannah, dated October 10, 2025. Third, a small brass key engraved with the words, Box 405. Beneath these lay a single sheet of heavy parchment paper, folded into neat quarters. I opened it. Written in Julian's unmistakable, sharp cursive was a single name, Clara, followed by a 10-digit telephone number. Before I could fully process what I was holding, the sharp click of leather heels echoed against the concrete floor of the shed. Victoria and Charles stepped into the dim light, Victoria's eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto the metal box in my hand. In an instant, the superficial mask of grief she had worn for weeks fell away. Her eyes widened in sheer panic. She rushed forward, abandoning all decorum, and forcefully snatched the box from my fingers. "Victoria, give that back to me," I said, my voice low but steady. "This didn't belong to Julian, Dad," she stammered, her voice rising an octave. She clutched the box to her chest as if it were made of solid gold. It's just a meaningless piece of junk. Probably some old car parts or trash he threw under the seat. You're obsessive right now. You're searching for ghosts." Charles stepped forward immediately, placing his broad, tailored shoulder between Victoria and me. He wore a pristine navy blue suit, looking entirely out of place in the dusty, oil-stained shed. He offered me one of his trademark, polished corporate smiles. The kind he used when he was about to restructure a department or lay off 50 factory workers. "You're grieving, Arthur," Charles said, his voice dripping with artificial warmth and condescension. "Your mind is playing tricks on you. Don't turn a meaningless trinket into some grand conspiracy. Let Victoria discard it. We need to focus on your health, on getting you past this tragedy." "Why is your hand shaking, Victoria?" I asked, staring directly at my daughter. She didn't answer. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the box. She gave Charles a frantic, silent look, and together they backed out of the equipment shed, heading toward the gravel driveway. I pretended to turn back toward the main house, making enough noise to suggest I was heading inside through the kitchen mudroom. But instead, I slipped silently behind the heavy, half-open wooden door of the old carriage house. Through the narrow gap, I watched them. Victoria's manicured hand was trembling so violently she almost dropped the box. "Dad can't find out about Clara," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking with pure terror. "If she brings that little girl here, the lawyers will tear the estate apart. We'll lose Julian's entire 35% share of Sterling Global. Everything we've worked for, Charles." Gone. Charles's face hardened into a mask of pure coldness. "Then we destroy the ring. No ring, no physical proof, no story. Clara has no standing without Julian's name on a legal marriage license. We keep our mouths shut and let the lawyers handle any inquiries." I couldn't listen to another second of their parasitic plotting. I threw the heavy carriage door open, the iron hinges groaning in protest, and stepped out into the damp gravel driveway. "What child are you talking about, Victoria?" My voice was a low, rumbling thunder. Victoria flinched as if she had been struck by lightning. Her hands flew up in shock, and the black magnetic box slipped from her grasp, crashing against the cracked concrete of the driveway with a sharp, hollow sound. The lid popped open. From its velvet cradle, the platinum band flew out, spinning in a brilliant, metallic blur across the concrete before rolling to a stop right against the toe of my worn leather shoe. I bent down, my eyes never leaving Victoria's face, and picked it up. Holding the heavy metal to the light, I peered inside the inner band. Engraved in tiny, elegant script was a simple inscription: J+C, October 12, 2025. That date was less than 3 weeks before Julian's fatal crash. I looked up, staring directly into my daughter's eyes. I had raised Victoria for 36 years. I knew every tell, every micro-expression, every defensive tick she possessed. When Victoria was caught in a lie, she would instinctively bite the inside of her lower lip, just as her mother Eleanor had done when she was anxious in her youth. At that moment, Victoria's teeth clamped down so hard on her lip that a tiny bead of crimson blood began to form at the corner of her mouth. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking as she tried to force a superficial laugh. You're misunderstanding. We were talking about a client, a child of one of Charles's associates. It has nothing to do with Julian, I swear. I didn't say a single word." The silence between us stretched out, suffocating and heavy. I calmly slipped the platinum ring and the folded parchment paper with Clara's phone number into the deep pocket of my wool trench coat. Victoria took a step backward, her eyes darting frantically toward Charles. But Charles's usual smooth, confident demeanor had completely evaporated. He stood there, his jaw clenched, his hands stuffed deep into his trouser pockets, refusing to meet my gaze. I took out my personal phone and, with slow, deliberate movements, dialed the 10-digit number written on the parchment. The screen glowed brightly in the rapidly darkening twilight of the driveway. 1 ring. 2 rings. The silence of the estate yard was absolute, broken only by the electronic hum of the speakerphone. On the 3rd ring, someone picked up. A woman's voice came through the line, choked with emotion, thick with the residue of unshed tears. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, Julian, is that you?" "Please no," I said, my voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief. "This is Arthur, Julian's father." There was a long, breathless pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of a sharp intake of breath, followed by a soft, choked sob. "You found the ring," she whispered. "You finally found the box." Before I could reply, a tiny, sweet, innocent voice drifted through the speaker from behind the woman's phone. "Mommy, is that Grandpa Arthur on the phone? Did Daddy finally tell him about us?" My chest tightened so violently I could barely breathe. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stood there, a 70-year-old patriarch, realizing in one devastating second that I had spent the last 4 years completely blind to the existence of my own granddaughter. I didn't call the police. I didn't scream at Victoria or Charles. I simply hung up the phone, turned my back on them, and walked away into the dark, leaving my daughter and her husband standing in the cold shadow of the empty garage. The next morning, the sky was a heavy, slate gray. I had arranged to meet Clara at a quiet, secluded botanical garden conservatory on the outskirts of Atlanta, far away from the bustling business district where Sterling Global Dynamics held its headquarters. I wanted space, air, and above all, silence. I arrived 20 minutes early, securing a cast-iron table tucked away in a corner of the glass greenhouse, surrounded by towering ferns and blooming white orchids. The air inside was warm and humid, a sharp contrast to the biting autumn chill outside. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the conservatory creaked open. I looked up and saw a slender woman step inside. She wore a simple, elegant charcoal wool coat, her pale face framed by dark, wavy hair that fell past her shoulders. She held the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. The child was dressed in a dark, forest green velvet coat and a matching wool beret. As they walked toward me, the little girl stopped, tilting her head slightly to the left to inspect a vibrant yellow orchid. My breath caught. My heart felt as though it were being squeezed in a vice. That head tilt, that exact, curious, slightly skeptical way of examining the world, was a carbon copy of Julian when he was a boy of 4. And when she turned her face toward me, her large, expressive hazel eyes met mine. It was like looking at a ghost. There was no need for a DNA test to tell me who this child belonged to. She carried the Sterling bloodline in every line of her gentle face. Clara sat down across from me, her posture remarkably poised despite the visible tension in her shoulders. She did not look at me with anger, nor did she look at me with the desperate, grasping eyes of someone seeking a financial handout. She was calm, dignified, and incredibly weary. Without saying a word, Clara unzipped her leather handbag, withdrew a thin, neatly organized leather folder, and placed it gently on the metal table between us. "I don't want your money, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying a profound, resonant strength. "Then what is it you want, Clara?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I want my daughter to grow up knowing that her father was not a coward who abandoned her," she replied, staring directly into my eyes. "And I want you to know the truth." She opened the folder. On top lay a glossy photograph. It was Julian, wearing blue hospital scrubs, his eyes shining with a radiant, tearful pride I hadn't seen in his face for nearly a decade. He was cradling a tiny newborn baby wrapped in a pink hospital blanket. Next came page after page of printed text messages spanning 4 years. There were detailed receipts for the platinum wedding band, a handwritten draft of Julian's wedding vows, written on the stationery of our Savannah office, and 2 round-trip airline tickets to Zurich, where Julian had planned to take Clara and Lily for a quiet, private wedding ceremony away from the family's toxic gaze. Finally, she opened her phone and pressed play on a video. I watched, my vision blurring with tears, as Julian, bent over and laughing, guided a tiny Lily as she painted a crude watercolor of a sailboat on a large sheet of easel paper. "Julian never told me about you," I choked out, wiping a tear from my cheek. "In 4 years, he never once mentioned your name or Lily's. If I had known—" Clara's brow furrowed, her eyes filling with a mixture of shock and sudden, profound sorrow. "He told me you refused to meet us," she said, her voice trembling. "He told me that when he first brought my name up, you called me a gold-digging opportunist. He said you threatened to disinherit him completely, to strip him of his share of Sterling Global Dynamics, and to banish him from the family if he ever saw me again." I stared at her, utterly stunned. "I never said those things. I never knew you existed. I would have welcomed you with open arms." We sat in the warm glass house as the pieces of a terrible, monstrous puzzle began to fall into place. Someone had systematically built a wall of lies between a father and a son. Clara quietly explained their history. They had met 6 years ago when Clara was working as a specialized pediatric nurse caring for one of Julian's close colleagues who had been hospitalized after a severe accident. They had fallen deeply, quietly in love. Julian had wanted to introduce her to me immediately, but every time he made plans, Victoria had intervened. On the day of Julian's funeral, Clara had stood at the very back of the cemetery, hidden behind a large oak tree, holding Lily in her arms so the child could say a silent goodbye to her daddy. Victoria had spotted them. Within seconds, Victoria had marched over, accompanied by 2 burly private security guards. In front of the mourning corporate executives and family friends, Victoria had pointed a finger in Clara's face, screaming that she was a fraudulent grifter trying to exploit a dead man's memory for a payday. The security guards had forcibly escorted Clara and her weeping 4-year-old daughter out of the cemetery gates, leaving them standing in the biting, freezing autumn rain. As Clara finished her story, Lily, who had been quietly sitting beside her mother, gently tugged at the sleeve of my heavy trench coat. Her tiny hand extended a folded piece of bright blue construction paper. On the front, drawn in shaky, crooked green crayon, was a sailboat with a large white sail. "This is for you, Grandpa Arthur," Lily whispered, her voice like a tiny bell. "Daddy said you loved the blue waters and wooden boats." A sob escaped my throat. Years ago, before Julian's mother Eleanor passed away, we had owned a beautiful vintage wooden sailboat named the Eleanor. It was my pride and joy, but after Eleanor died, the memory of our trips on the water was too painful, and I had sold it. Julian was the only person in the family who knew how deeply I regretted that decision. He had remembered. He had told his daughter. Clara reached into her coat and pulled out an old cracked iPhone. She unlocked it, opened a saved audio file, and placed the phone on the table. Julian's voice, slightly static-laden but vibrantly warm and familiar, filled the space between us. "Clara, sweetheart, if anything ever happens to me, if the stress of this company or my own mistakes catch up to me, do not go to Victoria. Do not trust her or Charles. Keep Lily safe. Wait. Wait until Dad finds the ring. He'll find it, Clara. I left it where only he would look. When he finds it, he'll know the truth. Trust my dad." Julian hadn't hidden his family because he was ashamed of them. He had hidden them because he was terrified of what Victoria and Charles would do to them if they found out. That afternoon, for the first time since my son's casket had been lowered into the ground, I did not cry out of grief. I was consumed by a cold, burning, merciless fury. My own daughter had turned my son into a fugitive within his own family. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the printed emails and text logs on Clara's old phone. Every line was a dagger to my heart. For 4 years, Victoria had acted as the sole gatekeeper of our family communications. When I sent Julian leather-bound journals and custom-made fly-fishing rods for his birthdays, Victoria had intercepted the packages. She told Julian I had thrown his gifts in the trash. She told me Julian had refused to accept them and sent them back with contempt. Did he try to contact me last Christmas?" I asked Clara, my chest tightening. "I was told he was spending the holidays in Aspen with friends and didn't want to be disturbed." Clara looked at me, her eyes shining with tears. "He called you 3 times on Christmas Eve, Mr. Sterling. He sat by our fireplace, dialing your number over and over. But every time, Victoria picked up. She told him you were in the private cardiac wing of the hospital, and that you had explicitly stated you didn't want to speak to a son who had disgraced the family name. In reality, on that cold Christmas Eve, I had sat entirely alone in the cavernous dining room of the Sterling estate, staring at a silent phone, wondering why my son had abandoned me. Victoria didn't need us to hate each other. She only needed each of us to believe that the other had turned away first. By keeping us separated by a wall of fabricated silence, she and Charles had maintained absolute control over the family dynamic, and more importantly, the corporate boardroom. But their greed had left a trail. "Julian discovered something right before his accident," Clara whispered, leaning closer. "He found massive, irregular transfers in the Sterling Global Ledger. He suspected Charles was secretly siphoning millions of dollars from the corporate accounts into a shell company registered under his brother's name. But Julian knew that if he brought it to you without bulletproof evidence, Victoria would simply manipulate you into taking their side. He needed something undeniable." Clara reached into her handbag once more and pulled out the brass key marked Box 405 that I had found tucked inside the platinum ring's magnetic box. "Julian rented a private, climate-controlled storage vault 30 miles north of the city," she said. "He told me that if anything ever happened to him, this key was the only thing that could save us." An hour later, I was driving my heavy SUV north along the highway, the dark pines whipping past in a blur. The heavy brass key sat in my palm, cold and reassuring. The storage facility was an old, secure brick warehouse tucked away in an industrial park. I showed the manager my credentials, signed the ledger, and was led down a long, echoing concrete corridor to Unit 405. The heavy metal roll-up door opened with a loud, rusty screech that shattered the silence of the warehouse. Inside, the unit was mostly empty, save for a small wooden table. Resting on the table was a heavy, military-grade steel safe. I knelt down, entered the master key code Julian had left in the notes, and inserted the brass key into the lock. With a heavy, satisfying click, the safe door swung open. Inside lay the ammunition for a corporate war. First, a certified copy of the Sterling Family Trust Agreement created by my late wife, Eleanor, before her passing. Second, Julian's handwritten financial ledger, detailing every discrepancy he had found in the corporate accounts over the last 18 months. Third, a sleek black backup hard drive containing raw data extracts from the company's servers. Fourth, a thick stack of printed bank invoices and wire transfer receipts. And fifth, a sealed cream envelope with my name written on it in Julian's neat, elegant handwriting. For Dad. Alongside these documents were Julian's notarized declaration of paternity for Lily, and their signed, unfiled marriage registration paperwork. I didn't touch the backup drive myself. I knew that in a legal war, the chain of custody was everything. I walked out into the chilly afternoon air and immediately dialed Harrison Croft, my personal estate attorney of 30 years, and Dr. Eris Thorne, a leading forensic accountant and cybersecurity specialist. 2 hours later, we met in the high-ceilinged, mahogany-paneled conference room of Harrison's downtown law office. Harrison put on his reading glasses and began to review the documents, his face growing increasingly solemn with every page he turned. He lightly tapped his gold pen against the polished oak desk, looking at me with deep concern. "Arthur," Harrison said softly, "your pain is immeasurable, and as your friend, my heart breaks for you. But you must understand, courts do not rule based on grief or emotional betrayal. They rule on what the guilty fear most: original records, timestamps, and the cold, unyielding flow of money." He laid out the legal reality of our situation. The platinum ring and the love letters, while emotionally devastating, did not constitute a legally binding marriage under Georgia law. Clara could not claim a spouse's share of Julian's estate. But Lily's rights were an entirely different matter. My late wife Eleanor's original trust agreement was ironclad. It clearly dictated that if either of our children passed away, that child's entire 35% share of Sterling Global Dynamics would bypass spouses and siblings, transferring directly to their biological offspring through an independent, protective grandchild's trust. Victoria and Charles had known this. They had officially declared to the probate court and the corporate board of directors that Julian had died single, childless, and intestate. To secure his shares, they had submitted a signed share transfer agreement, claiming that Julian had voluntarily transferred his entire 35% holding to Victoria just 3 days before his fatal accident. Dr. Eris Thorne, the forensic accountant, connected the black backup hard drive to his secure laptop. Within minutes, his fingers were flying across the keyboard, pulling up the digital metadata of the transfer document Victoria and Charles had filed. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Thorne said, pointing to the glowing monitor, "the signature on this document is an incredibly sophisticated digital trace of Julian's signature. To the naked eye, it looks authentic, but look at the file creation metadata. The digital certificate shows this document was created, compiled, and digitally signed using Charles Vance's corporate administrator credentials exactly 36 hours after Julian's official time of death. The transfer was a total, fraudulent forgery. My daughter and her husband had stolen 35% of my company from a dead man and a 4-year-old child. I could have called the district attorney right then. I could have had Victoria and Charles arrested at their multi-million-dollar lakeside home in front of their wealthy neighbors. But I didn't. I wanted to look into my daughter's eyes one last time and hear her lie to me. I wanted to see the depth of her deception with my own eyes. At twilight, I invited Victoria and Charles to the family estate for dinner. The house was quiet, filled with the long, dark shadows of autumn. I instructed the housekeeper to prepare Julian's favorite meal: roasted prime rib and fingerling potatoes. We sat in the grand, formal dining room beneath the crystal chandelier that Eleanor had bought in Paris decades ago. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, with Victoria on my right and Charles on my left. I placed my personal phone in the center of the table, screen facing down, its high-definition voice recorder already running. I kept my face perfectly calm, adopting the mask of a tired, broken old father who was simply looking for comfort from his remaining family. As the main course was served, I took a slow sip of my red wine, looked across the table, and casually brought up the name I had found in the glove box. "I was cleaning out the carriage house today," I said, my voice soft, almost fragile, "and I came across a piece of paper. It had a name written on it. Clara. Do either of you know who she is?" Victoria froze mid-bite. Her face instantly hardened, turning a ghostly chalky white. She slowly lowered her sterling silver fork, letting it slip from her fingers to strike her porcelain plate with a sharp metallic clatter. "Clara," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "She's a manipulative, low-class con artist, Dad. Don't let her blackmail you. She used to constantly stalk Julian, clinging to him for his money. She's absolute trash." Charles quickly leaned forward, inserting himself into the conversation with practiced, smooth urgency. "That's absolutely right, Arthur," Charles said, shaking his head with a look of deep, simulated concern. "That child she's parading around definitely isn't Julian's. She's just a gold digger looking to dig her claws into the Sterling family fortune. We've been keeping her away to protect your health." I raised my head, my eyes locking onto Charles, and then shifting to Victoria. The silence in the dining room became suffocating. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "I only asked about a woman named Clara," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, flat register. "I never said she had a child." The dining room fell into an absolute, terrifying stillness. Victoria's breath hitched. She sat entirely paralyzed, her mouth slightly open. Charles's hand shook as he tried to lift his wine glass, tilting it and spilling several dark red drops of Cabernet onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. It looked like fresh blood against the fabric. We were just guessing, Arthur. Charles stammered, his polished corporate confidence rapidly disintegrating. He forced a dry, uneasy chuckle, leaning back in his leather chair and adopting a colder, defensive posture. Look, you're clearly not well. The grief has been hard on all of us, but you're becoming paranoid. We think it's time for you to temporarily step down as chairman of Sterling Global Dynamics and get some real rest. We can handle the day-to-day operations. Are you planning to take my chairman's seat the exact same way you took Julian's 35% share? I asked. Victoria slammed her open palm against the table, sending the crystal water glasses rattling. She shot to her feet, her face flushed with a mixture of rage and panic. Julian signed those share transfer documents voluntarily, Dad, she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. He didn't want that woman or that bastard child to inherit a single dime of our family's legacy. I did what I had to do. So you admit you knew they existed, I said, looking up at my daughter. I did it to protect this family, she shouted, her lip trembling, a tiny drop of blood reappearing where she had bitten it the day before. No, Victoria, I said, my voice cracking with a sorrow so deep it felt like a physical wound. You didn't do it to protect the family. You did it to protect the money you stole from a 4-year-old child. Charles clenched his fists, his jaw grinding so hard I could hear the bone click. He glared at me, his eyes cold and threatening. If you continue to stir up this ridiculous trouble, Arthur, the board of directors will meet tomorrow morning. We have enough votes to review your mental capacity and strip you of your executive authority. Don't ruin your own legacy over a phantom grandchild. I did not flinch. I slowly reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the digital forensic log printed by Dr. Thorne. I slid the paper across the mahogany table. It stopped right in front of Charles. Charles, you testified to the probate court that Julian signed the transfer agreement 3 days before his accident. Correct? That's correct, Charles muttered, glaring at the paper. Then explain this, I said, pointing a finger at the highlighted metadata. Why was the original digital transfer file created, formatted, and authorized from your private office IP address exactly 36 hours after my son's heart had already stopped beating? Charles froze, his eyes scanning the technical timestamps on the paper. The smug, arrogant smile that had defined his face for years vanished in an instant. He turned a sickly green, looking at Victoria for support. But Victoria was staring at me with a gaze so cold, so filled with a strange, desperate hatred, that I could no longer recognize the little girl I had once held in my arms. You don't know what Julian was doing behind your back, Dad, Victoria whispered, her voice deadly quiet. Oh, I know exactly what he was doing, I replied. He was tracing the $650,000 that you and Charles stole from the corporate accounts. The next 3 weeks passed in a heavy, suffocating silence. I didn't confront Victoria or Charles again, and they, realizing the ice beneath their feet was cracking, avoided the family estate entirely. But behind that wall of silence, a storm was brewing. I turned everything over to Harrison Croft's elite legal team and Dr. Eris Thorne's forensic auditing firm. Harrison immediately filed an urgent ex parte document preservation request with the court. Under the strict supervision of a court-appointed marshal, Dr. Thorne's team entered our corporate headquarters at midnight, executing a complete physical and digital backup of the company's entire mainframes and localized email servers. Every data block was digitally sealed and encrypted with verification hash codes, ensuring that neither Victoria, who held senior system administration privileges, nor Charles could alter a single byte of data. Then the numbers began to speak, and what they said was a tale of monstrous betrayal. Dr. Thorne's auditors dissected 18 months of transactions, uncovering a series of phantom consulting fee invoices totaling exactly $650,000. The payments had been wired from Sterling Global's primary operations account to a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The physical address of that shell corporation was a tiny run-down apartment in downtown Savannah, rented by Charles's younger brother. From there, the trail led directly to the mortgage lender of Victoria and Charles's newly acquired 5-acre lakeside estate. They had literally built their luxury on my son's stolen blood. Even more sickening was how they had concealed the theft. Every single fraudulent invoice had been authorized using Julian's corporate digital signature on the exact days. Julian was out of the country on international business trips. Victoria, abusing her system administrator credentials, had bypassed security protocols, reset Julian's private access passwords, approved the massive wire transfers under his name, and then restored his old password. They were systematically setting up Julian to take the fall for their embezzlement if the auditors ever caught wind of the missing funds. One cold midnight, sitting alone in my dark study, I opened the final video file recovered from the hard drive Julian had left in storage unit 405. Julian's face appeared on the large monitor. He looked incredibly thin, his eyes hollowed out by exhaustion, dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. He was sitting in what looked like a sterile hotel room, a desk lamp casting long, harsh shadows across his face. "Dad?" Julian began, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "If you're watching this, it means I wasn't brave enough to tell you all of this in person. Or maybe I didn't make it. I'm not angry with you, Dad. I never was. I'm just so incredibly tired. Every time I tried to take a step toward you, every time I tried to drive out to the estate to clear the air, Victoria would call me. She'd tell me you had closed the door, that you had rewritten your will, and that seeing me would only cause you another heart attack. I wanted to believe she was lying, but she had the emails, she had your signature. Dad, I love you. I hope the truth reaches you before they destroy everything." I paused the video. I lowered my head onto my mahogany desk, my hands trembling uncontrollably as heavy, racking sobs tore through my chest. For 6 weeks I had blamed a rainy mountain curve and a patch of slick asphalt for taking my son away from me. Only then did I understand the devastating truth. Victoria hadn't just lost her brother. She had actively, systematically stolen him from me years before he ever crashed. Alongside our financial investigation, the legal filing to establish Lily's rightful inheritance moved forward with lethal precision. Harrison Croft compiled Julian's notarized paternity declaration, the private health insurance documents where Julian had listed Lily as his biological daughter, and a certified DNA analysis from an independent court-recognized laboratory. We didn't rely on the platinum wedding ring as our sole piece of evidence. The ring was never the destination. It was merely the key that had unlocked the vault of secrets. Just as our massive case file was finalized, my phone rang in the dead of night. The caller ID showed Dr. Eris Thorne. "Arthur," Dr. Thorne said, his voice tense with adrenaline. "We have an emergency. Charles has just bypassed the normal scheduling queue and called an emergency board of directors meeting for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. His agenda item is the immediate, fire sale liquidation of Sterling Global Dynamics' largest logistics and shipping assets." My heart hammered in my chest. "He's trying to dump the assets." "Exactly," Harrison Croft chimed in on a three-way call. "He's realized the forensic audit is closing in on him. He wants to sell off the company's physical infrastructure, convert the assets to cash, and transfer the liquid funds to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands before we can file a formal indictment. We have exactly 48 hours before he strips the company down to an empty shell." From that moment on, this was no longer just a grieving father's quest for truth. It was a high-stakes, breathless race against time to stop two greedy sociopaths from burning down the entire legacy of my family and destroying the future of hundreds of employees who relied on Sterling Global Dynamics for their livelihoods. That very night, Harrison Croft worked until the dawn, compiling our emergency filing. By 8:30 the next morning, we had secured an emergency ex parte temporary restraining order from a federal judge. The order was a legal guillotine. It immediately halted any sale of corporate assets, froze the voting rights of the disputed 35% shareholding, mandated the absolute preservation of all digital and physical accounting records, and temporarily suspended Charles Vance from his position as Chief Operating Officer pending a full evidentiary hearing. At 9 o'clock, the boardroom of Sterling Global Dynamics was suffocatingly tense. Charles sat at the head of the long glass table, leaning back in his leather chair with an air of smug, untouchable arrogance. He had already laid out the resolution to liquidate our shipping terminals, and was preparing to call for a vote. He raised his hand, looking around the room at the quiet, intimidated board members, all those in favor of the immediate liquidation of our southern logistics assets. The heavy oak double doors of the boardroom burst open. I walked in, my back straight, my chin held high. Beside me was Harrison Croft, followed by two armed federal court marshals and a licensed process server. Charles shot to his feet, sending his heavy leather chair toppling backward onto the carpet with a loud, hollow thud. His face turned a deep, furious crimson. "Arthur," Charles sneered, trying to maintain his corporate authority. "Are you really going to destroy this entire logistics empire? Everything your father built, just to indulge the desperate fantasies of some strange blackmailing woman?" I stopped at the opposite end of the table, resting my hands firmly on the polished wood. I looked at him, my voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of work. No, Charles, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. I'm saving this company from a thief who has the audacity to call embezzlement management. Victoria, who was sitting adjacent to Charles, stood up, her face pale, her eyes wild with a mixture of fear and resentment. Dad, she cried, her voice trembling, you're choosing outsiders over your own daughter. You're tearing this family apart. I turned my cold, unyielding gaze toward her. You threw my 4-year-old granddaughter out of her own father's funeral, Victoria, I said, each word heavy with quiet disgust. Do not stand there, in the house my hard work built, and lecture me about family. The process server stepped forward, bypassing the stunned board members, and placed the federal court order directly on the glass table in front of Charles. Charles, I said, from this exact second, you are officially suspended from your duties. You are legally barred from deleting a single email, transferring a single dollar of company funds, or touching any accounts associated with my son Julian. Step away from the table. Charles gripped the paper, his fingers shaking so violently the page rattled. He looked around the boardroom, silently begging the other shareholders for support, but every single one of them lowered their eyes, refusing to meet his gaze. His kingdom of lies had officially collapsed, but the final, most devastating blow was yet to come. As we walked out of the boardroom, Dr. Eris Thorne approached me in the corridor, holding a newly retrieved certified bank statement. His face was grim. Arthur, Dr. Thorne said softly, you need to see this. We just bypassed the security layer on Julian's personal bank account. I looked at the transaction log. On the very afternoon of Julian's funeral, before the banking system had received his official death certificate and frozen his personal accounts, someone had logged into his online banking app. They had executed a wire transfer of exactly $120,000 from Julian's personal savings. The digital trail showed that the one-time passcode, OTP verification code required to complete the transfer had been sent directly to Victoria's personal cell phone number. My own daughter had literally robbed her brother's savings account while his body lay in a casket at the front of the chapel. I clenched the paper in my hand, my knuckles turning white, my heart breaking into pieces. I had thought Charles was the only snake in my home, but that paper told me a far worse truth. My daughter was the one who had opened the cage. 11 days later, we walked into the municipal courtroom for the full evidentiary hearing. Victoria arrived wearing a modest, unadorned black dress, her hair pulled back tightly, her face entirely pale and devoid of makeup in a pathetic attempt to garner the judge's sympathy. Charles sat beside her, still trying to project an aura of wealth in an expensive Italian suit, but his eyes darted constantly around the room, tracking every movement. My legal team stood before the bench. With methodical, devastating precision, Harrison Croft presented our mountain of evidence: the Eleanor Sterling Family Trust Agreement, the certified DNA results proving Lily's parentage, the digital server logs proving the share transfer document was created 36 hours after Julian's death, and the bank logs detailing the embezzlement. Charles's defense attorney tried to argue that Julian had verbally agreed to the transfer before his death, but in the face of the immutable electronic server logs, those arguments sounded hollow, desperate, and pathetic. The judge turned to me, allowing me to speak as the trustee of the family estate. I stood up, walked to the center of the courtroom, and turned to look directly at Victoria. Victoria, I said, my voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. You didn't just take Julian's money. You took away a 4-year-old child's right to say a final goodbye to her father. You took 4 precious years of life between a grandfather and his only granddaughter from me. You took away the final phone calls my son and I should have had on Christmas Eve. You traded your brother's soul for a lake house. Tears finally welled in Victoria's eyes. She collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands, her voice choking with desperate sobs. I didn't want to do it, Dad, she wailed, pointing a trembling finger at Charles. Charles forced me to do it. He said we would lose everything if Julian exposed the consulting fees. He made me sign the transfer. Harrison Croft immediately stepped forward, holding up a printout of an encrypted email Victoria had sent to Charles the night before Julian's funeral. Harrison read it aloud for the record. Charles, we have to make sure Clara doesn't get anywhere near Dad or the funeral until the transfer papers are finalized. If Dad sees that little girl, he'll recognize her instantly, and we'll lose Julian's 35% share of the company. Keep them away at all costs. Charles jumped to his feet, screaming at his wife. You lying snake, it was your idea from the very beginning. You're the one who had the server admin codes. You said no one would ever find out. Victoria screamed back, her face twisted in rage. I watched them tear each other apart in the middle of the sacred court of law. their superficial marriage dissolving into a toxic pool of mutual recrimination. You two never loved each other, I said quietly. You only loved what you stole together. The judge struck his wooden gavel with a resounding crack, silencing the screaming couple. The court ruled immediately. The temporary restraining order was made permanent. All of Charles's management authority was stripped. The disputed 35% shareholding was frozen under the court's custody, pending the formal transfer of the inheritance to Lily. And the entire file, the forged signatures, the wire fraud, the server manipulation, and the grand larceny, was referred directly to the federal criminal prosecutors. The consequences did not unfold in a single afternoon. But once the first lie had been dragged into the glaring light of day, every remaining corporate record became a door that Victoria and Charles could no longer lock. 6 months later, the justice system completed its work. The forged share transfer document was officially declared null and void. Julian's entire 35% share of Sterling Global Dynamics was transferred in full into an independent protective trust established solely for Lily, under the supervision of Harrison Croft's firm, until she reached her 21st birthday. Faced with a mountain of undeniable digital forensics and a trail of siphoned cash, Charles accepted a plea agreement to avoid a maximum sentence. He was prosecuted for corporate document forgery, wire fraud, and grand larceny, and was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary, alongside a court order to repay every single dollar he had siphoned from the company. Victoria cooperated fully with the investigators to avoid prison time, but the cost of her freedom was absolute. She was fired from the company, her professional reputation was completely obliterated, and she was forced to sell her sprawling lakeside estate, her luxury vehicles, and all her personal investments to repay the $120,000 she had stolen from Julian's account, and her share of the embezzled corporate funds. She was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a tiny, rented one-bedroom apartment in the city. I did not transfer Lily's trust assets to Clara directly. Together with Harrison, we established a transparent, structured care system that paid directly for Lily's private schooling, her medical needs, and her future college tuition, ensuring she would never have to worry about her security again. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after the trial, the housekeeper informed me that someone was waiting on my front porch. I opened the heavy mahogany front door. Standing there in the cold, dripping autumn rain was Victoria. She looked gaunt, her cheeks hollow, her expensive designer clothes replaced by a cheap, worn trench coat. She was trembling from the cold. "Dad," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I lost everything. I've sold everything to pay back the restitution. I can barely afford groceries. Will you let me come back to the company? Just as an ordinary entry-level data entry clerk. I just need a job. I need to survive." I looked at my daughter, the girl I had raised, the girl who had sold her brother's memory for a piece of real estate. My heart ached for the child she used to be, but my voice remained as cold and unyielding as granite. "I didn't take anything from you, Victoria," I said. "You did this to yourself. I will not fund you so you can repeat your wrongdoing. I have simply returned what you took from others." Will you never forgive me, Dad?" she sobbed, reaching out a hand. I took a half step back, my voice steady. "Maybe one day I will find it in my heart to forgive you, Victoria. But forgiveness does not mean handing the keys back to the person who once burned down your house." I closed the door, shutting out the rain and the girl who had chosen greed over blood. 2 weeks later, the first shareholder meeting of the newly restructured Sterling Global Dynamics took place. Charles's chair at the head of the boardroom table had been permanently removed. I smiled warmly as I personally opened the double doors, ushering Clara and Lily into the high-tech conference room. I placed a certified copy of Lily's legal ownership rights in the exact center of the round glass table, right in front of the board of directors. "This is not a gift," I announced to the room. "This has belonged to her since the second she was born." The shareholders stood as one, filling the room with a thunderous round of applause. Clara looked at me, a single silent tear of relief rolling down her cheek, while Lily looked up at me with her bright, innocent hazel eyes. "Grandpa Arthur," Lily whispered, tugging my sleeve. "Where is Daddy's ring?" I suddenly realized it. The platinum band had remained in my suit pocket ever since that dark day in the carriage house the next morning, on what would have been Julian's 33rd birthday. The autumn rain finally stopped. The thick fog cleared, and a brilliant golden morning sun broke through the clouds, warming the crisp forest air. Clara, Lily, and I walked through the quiet city cemetery, carrying a beautiful bouquet of blue hydrangeas and a small wooden model of a sailboat. We stopped before the polished granite headstone engraved with my son's name, Julian Sterling. I knelt down on the damp grass, pulled the heavy platinum ring from my coat pocket, and placed it gently into Clara's palm. Clara accepted it, her hand shaking. She didn't put it on her finger, because she understood that she and Julian had never had the chance to complete their earthly vows. Instead, she threaded the heavy platinum band onto a thin, elegant silver chain and carefully fastened it around Lily's neck. "This ring doesn't make you his legal wife, Clara," I said softly. "But it proves to the entire world that you were never lying, and it proves that when Julian died, he did not die alone. He died as a husband and a father." Lily reached out her tiny hand, her fingers tracing the deeply engraved letters of her father's name on the stone. She looked up at me, her face bathed in the warm morning light. "Grandpa Arthur, does Daddy know you found us? Does he know we're safe now?" I pulled my granddaughter close, wrapping her in my arms, feeling a profound, deep-seated peace settle into my soul for the first time in 43 days. "If your father hid the ring to lead me to you, sweetie," I whispered, kissing her forehead, "then I think he knows. I think he's watching us right now, smiling." As we slowly walked away from the cemetery, Lily's tiny hand clasped firmly in mine. The platinum ring shimmered brilliantly against her chest in the morning sunlight. The ring didn't prove a legal marriage, but it proved that my son had spent his final years surrounded by a pure, beautiful love. The betrayers had tried to use Julian's tragic death to erase his true family and steal his legacy. In the end, the very ring they had tried so desperately to throw away was the one thing that brought our family back to where we belonged. Thank you for joining Arthur's real-life justice. The truth may arrive late, and the journey may be paved with tears, but justice always, inevitably finds its way home.